republican calendar. But then in 1949, the communists took over and got rid of this system. But China's former republican government fled to the island of Formosa and became the government of Taiwan. And they continued using the republican calendar, and indeed still use it to this day. It is sometimes called the Mingguo, or national calendar. We are currently living in Mingguo year 108, with Mingguo New Year being every October 10th. This is the Taiwanese national holiday, sometimes called Double 10 Day. Fun fact, the Taiwanese even had their own mini Y2K panic back in 2011 for Mingguo year 100. They were worried their computers would not be able to handle going from 2-digit years to 3-digit years. But much like the real Y2K, the so-called Y1C problem wound up being a bit of a non-event. Alright, so my Spanish friend Carlos tells me that there is a tradition in his country of turning the names of their presidents into era names. So right now they are in the Sanchismo, which began when President Pedro Sanchez took power. And before that was the Anzarismo of President J.M. Aznar. And before that, the Felipismo under President Felipe Gonzalez. Some of my friends in Brazil told me about a new trendy tradition in that country where they call the money after the presidents. So from 2011 to 2016, you had some people calling the money Dilmas after President Dilma Rousseff. And then from 2016 to 2019, Temers after President Michel Temer. And now they are apparently working on a new nickname with old man Bolsonaro in charge. Brazilian friend Camina also tells me that the Brazilians like to call the years between 1964 and 1985, when the country was ruled by a very brutal military dictatorship, the Years of Lead, or Anos de Chumbo. And the first happier half of the 20th century is the Anos Dourados, or Years of Gold. It seems the Brazilian golden years are quite closely associated with a sort of 1950s era greaser type culture in particular, which I must confess I was not aware was even a thing in Brazil. The Indonesians have a similar system in which the years before the dictatorship of General Suharto are called the Orde Lam, or Old Order, while the Suharto years themselves are called the Orde Baru, or New Order. This started off as something Suharto made up for himself to make his regime sound cooler, but has now sort of taken on a darker tone. I see some people are nostalgic for the New Order. It is amazing to me that no matter how brutal a dictatorship is, there will always be some people who are nostalgic for it. Although sometimes the nostalgia isn't entirely political. Like if, say, Canada had been run by a dictatorship in the 1990s, I probably would still have some nostalgia for that era, just because, you know, I would have good memories of going to school and making friends and stuff like that. I'm sure even in North Korea, you probably have people that are like, oh, I miss the Kim Jong-un era, the fashions were much cooler back then. Now let us go back to Spain for a moment. That country was, of course, ruled by the dictator Francisco Franco for many decades. My friend Pablo says that the following clip from 1975 is what many Spaniards would identify as being the symbolic end of the Franco era.
Españoles, Franco ha muerto.
Pablo says the press and such would reference it from time to time to make some parallelism between that moment and the closing of some other era of the Spanish political life. I see the clip also makes an appearance in this episode of a Spanish soap opera set in the 1970s, which I can only assume is an accurate depiction of what Spanish life was like in that moment. Here is a similar clip from my Russian friend, von Peterhoff, who says that this is a common symbol of the beginning of Russia's current era. This is President Boris Yeltsin announcing his tearful resignation on New Year's Eve, 1999.
Последний раз обращаюсь к вам как президент России.
The beginning of the Putin era. Now, some viewers said that in their country, a historic era is kind of a vague thing that lacks a clear beginning or end. For example, Tom says in Ireland, we have an odd term where we refer to the past as Catholic Ireland. You'll see it a lot in papers which are attacking some bad thing from the past, vaguely related to the Catholic Church. I'm not sure when exactly Catholic Ireland ended per se. I'd say at some stage in the 1990s, but I don't know. I bet that after the recent passage of those referendums on gay marriage and abortion, You probably had a lot of Irish papers talking about how the final nails were put in the coffin of the Catholic era. Seif asks me, was the fall of the Berlin Wall too much of a low-hanging fruit? I guess it sort of is. Certainly one of the most cliched end of an era moments of the 20th century. We use the fall of the Berlin Wall not only to represent the end of the Cold War, but the collapse of global communism more broadly. But as my friend Martin says, in Germany, the fall of the Berlin Wall is regarded much more narrowly and specifically as the moment in which East and West Germany unified into one country, and thus heralded the beginning of the modern-day German nation. This is one of the big memes of German unification. It is the cover of a West German humor magazine, supposedly depicting an East German having a banana for the first time. It is a kind of mean-spirited joke about the supposed shelteredness of the East Germans, although very much in tune with the sort of prevalent West German attitude of the time. When you Google Mein erst Banana, you get like a million matches and parodies of it. Then there is this thing, which is the Trabant, a horrible kind of East German car. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, a big flood of these things came into West Germany, which represented a sort of cultural merging of the two nations. Check out this Google Doodle they made for the anniversary of the unification. A Volkswagen and a Trabant being friends. How sweet. And of course you can buy all sorts of souvenirs depicting the great Trabant migration of '89. The fall of communism is of course a defining moment for a lot of other countries too. My friend Paul says, we in Romania organized time in relation to the 1989 revolution against communism and speak about events as before the revolution and after the revolution. He adds that December 22, 1989 is their most iconic day, since that is when Romania's communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his ghastly wife attempted to flee the country via helicopter, as depicted in this iconic photo here. And now he says a lot of streets are named December 22nd. According to my friend Jashino, in Czechoslovakia they have a much sillier image representing the fall of communism: short trousers. This is because the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, infamously wore pants that were way too short during his inauguration. And apparently this was a very endearing image to a lot of Czechs, since a lot of Czechs consider unfashionableness to be one of their defining national traits. South Africa never had communism, but they define their modern history in relation to the apartheid era, which began in the early 1950s, and the post-apartheid era, which began in 1994. Eliminating racial segregation and allowing black South Africans to vote for the first time was obviously a very transformative moment for that country. My South African friend DeWald shares these photos as being some of the most iconic representations of that transition. My friend Elijah says that in the Philippines, there was the whole People Power Revolution of 1986, which ousted Marcos from his 21-year presidency. That tends to be the marker of generations for Filipinos as opposed to Gen X or millennials. My other Filipino friend tells me that these are some of the most iconic photos of that revolution. Nuns walking, a woman giving a flower to a soldier, and people hanging on lampposts. Sometimes, however, an attempt to create a new iconic moment heralding the beginning of a new era for the country winds up being a gigantic flop. My Uruguayan friend says, in Uruguay, when our current president came to power for his first term in 2004, he said, "Festejen, Uruguayos! Festejen!" Because it was the first time an explicitly left-wing party got the presidency. Now that phrase is mostly used ironically by other party supporters when pointing out problems with the left's policies and administration. I guess you might be wondering if good old Canada has any interesting ways of dividing up our history. The main one is just what we would call Confederation, which is when the modern Constitution of Canada was signed in 1867. When you study Canadian history, everything is described as either being pre-Confederation or post-Confederation. For example, take this textbook, Documents in Pre-Confederation History. Sounds like a fun beach read. This painting here of all of Canada's political big shots in 1867 is the iconic symbol of Confederation. In Quebec, meanwhile, they have a situation that is sort of similar to what my Irish friend was describing earlier. Today, Quebec is a very secular, progressive society, but it certainly didn't used to be. Quebecers accordingly sometimes use the phrase "la grande noirceur," or the Great Darkness, to refer to the time in which Quebec was a far more Catholic and conservative place.